I'll be honest, there's a part of that ethos that I don't entirely understand in the sense of like, could we just focus on like actually teaching people how to do research and teaching students good ethics and good critical thinking and how to actually do a real science? Like, we could do that.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Welcome. I'm here today with David Robbins, a licensed professional counselor. I think we're going to have a great conversation, and there's a lot of directions we can go here. So welcome, David.
Thank you for having me.
So to start off, kind of give us a little bit of your history, background, what inspired you to kind of go into this field, focus on mental health, become a therapist?
Yeah, so I mean, I think like a lot of us, like I've always had an interest in human behavior. I'm originally a musician by trade, so I mainly taught piano lessons for many years. And before I got into psychology, one of the things that I had noted just about myself as a piano teacher was that I was very interested in like the more mental aspects. Even like I would get into, even like neuroscience about, hey, what does music do to the brain? Like that was always a thing that I did. And, maybe attribute some of that to like my late father was a math and physics professor. And so, I grew up in a very scientific household. But I say that, like I say, like I was teaching like high performance, like, really high level piano. And like I say, a lot of it was I was very interested in the brain and the mental aspects of that. And so when I went back to college, I'd been before and then I quit. And then when I finally went back, it's like, well, what am I going to do here? And so originally I was in the music therapy program. And this will relate to probably some of what we will discuss a little further into this podcast. But due to some, we'll just start with saying philosophical differences with the music therapy department in particular. Because my plan was my plan was always to have my LPC and get my graduate degrees and all of that. Sorry about the thumbs up there. I thought I had that turned off. That was always the plan, but I originally wanted to do music therapy because that was going to be a license that I could get at the bachelor's level, and because they do that here in Missouri, at least they did. And so that was my original plan. But then due to some issues, I just went to just straight psychology because I realized, well, when I get my, my license, my LPC here in Missouri, when I get that, I can do basically any approved therapy, providing I have adequate training, adequate experience. So that's kind of how I got into it. I originally was like in undergrad, I had met a psychiatrist, one who was actually pretty well trained in psychology and psychotherapy. And we actually did clinical research on the use of sound and music as either an adjunct to traditional therapies, whether it was medication related or psychotherapy, or even as an alternative. So an alternative or replacement to those traditional treatments. And I mentioned that because that's also going to come up in this conversation, because I've made some notes ahead of time, but like it's very relevant to like, the conversation at hand. And then I did get a couple specialties. I have an addiction specialty. So I took the fancy pants NADAC exam for that. And I also have studied quite a bit on autism spectrum disorder. But I'm kind of a generalist for the most part. I don't really necessarily stick to one thing. It's more of a short list of what I don't do.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I'm already really interested because you've got kind of this mixed background with the music side of things. So you're talking about neuroscience and, it was your dad who's in math and physics, I think you said.
Yep.
So this very analytical side of things. And then you got the whole different side of things with the music side. So you kind of, you're coming into a therapy perspective, working both sides of the brain, which I think is pretty unique for the most part.
Yes. Yeah, and I also used to be an EMT. So that was another thing I did for a while. And so I also have, like, when I wasn't on the ambulance, I worked for a while in emergency departments and clinics and such, effectively kind of as a nurse, although they're using more EMTs now, I know, in hospitals. But I So yeah, like I draw from a lot of, yeah, like you say, like I really do draw from a lot of different experiences and different knowledge bases, which I like to think, helps with, like work we do as therapists. Obviously, like my LPC license doesn't necessarily say, hey, you need to go down this medical road, with a patient. However, the adjacent to our conversation, I'm pretty bullish about, like when I've worked with students, when I've had students, I'm very bullish about, like, you really need to like learn things like differential diagnosis and in the sense of, all right, so for the uninitiated that may hear this, differential diagnosis is on a real low level. It's basically, when is a thing not a thing? So if we say, well, it looks like an anxiety disorder. Well, is it an anxiety disorder? We should run through
Rule
all
out.
these diagnostic trees and these decision trees, and we need to look at all of this and say, okay, well, is it anxiety or is it something else, right? If you're going to go down the road of diagnosis anyway. And I don't want to get too far down that rabbit trail at the moment, but, it's one of those things where, yeah, like I say, I do draw on a lot of those different experiences, and I feel like it helps, but I don't know any different. So,
Mm.
it's kind of hard to say. I don't really have much to compare it to.
Yeah, I mean, in my program, it's weird because like you don't get nearly as like almost zero psychology in my
Mm.
program, and you have people coming from communications or sociology or these other disciplines, and I'm thinking you're going to be licensed with like no like education in like psychology, and that seems off to me.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said it first. It was something I was going to bring up, but I kept thinking, now, what's the lead in here? But to your point, because I've had a lot of students over the years since I've been licensed, and both, post grad and in internships. And I mean, at the risk of sounding like I'm standing on my ivory tower here, I sometimes work with people, and even people that have been licensed for a while, and I'm scratching my head thinking, like, what did they teach you? Like, where's the, I don't know, again, hard to compare, but
When did you get licensed?
I was originally, let's see, I have to think about 2010.
Okay. I've noticed somewhere between 5 and 10 years ago, there was a shift. People who graduated prior to that seem to have gotten mostly good educations, and people since then, it's something has changed.
Yeah, so yeah, I don't know. Well, I can name some things. I will first start with, before I throw out some observations, the first thing I just want to preface this for everyone is that if someone wants to know what the cause is or the list of causes, I would argue this is clearly like a multivariate problem. Like, we're not going to be able to pin it down to one thing. But that being said, again, I don't know what started it precisely. Heck, I'm not even sure what it started it generally. But one thing I can definitely say I have observed is I don't know, we could sum it up as saying, there's a lot of pop psychology being pushed. There's a lot of, and I can give some loose definitions for this, and there's a lot of like pseudoscience being pushed. I don't see, I mean, one of the notes, I'm looking at my notes that I made. One of the notes I made is that, well, I'll just read it how I wrote it. A lot of new therapists cannot critical think their way out of a paper bag to save their lives, which I know sounds a little harsh. I feel like I'm probably understating it a bit. And the reason I said, oh, go ahead. I don't know if you had a
No, I
question
mean,
there.
I feel like some of this is not necessarily an intrinsic IQ problem. I think we're
Oh,
taught to reject critical thinking skills.
yes. Yeah. So, yeah, I don't think, like, most of the people, like, if I'm talking about like students, for example, I wouldn't say that these folks are unintelligent.
Hmm.
I would
Yeah.
not. Like, if someone said, "Are you saying they're unintelligent?" No, no, I agree with how you're framing it. Is that, like, you're kind of taught, and so, like, I also made that note about there's this anti-intellectualism. Even though the APA would completely disagree, and a lot of professors would probably disagree as well. And a lot of people would disagree with that assessment that there's this anti-intellectualism that's pervading the social sciences in general. I see it all the time. Like, I mean, can I give some examples? Because
Yeah, please do.
so let's start with science reporting. The psychology and the social sciences, like this issue is not unique. So it's not unique to our fields. So I just want to be clear to everyone, but it is, I do see it a lot. So let's look at science reporting just in mass at large. So one thing you'll see, and you may have noticed this, that science reporting they'll say study shows or study proves. You see that a lot, right? Well, if you know anything about the actual scientific method, you're laughing because you know what I'm talking about. If you know anything about the actual scientific method, anything that follows that initial clause, study shows or study proves, is false. It doesn't matter what you say,
Yeah.
it is categorically false. And people say, no, it's not. Well, it is, because that's not really not how science generally works. Like, very rarely do we get to say
Yeah.
we've proven X thing. We almost never, like, an example of this is where we have pretty well done that, and it's a short list in the universe, in the pantheon of science. It's a short list of things like the law of gravity. I don't think people really understand why we actually call it a law. The layman's version is we've basically observed it to be true in 100% of circumstances. We've never not, like, does that make sense? Like,
Yeah.
we've never been able to, like, for the most part, anytime you go to try to prove it one way or another, like, for the most part, it's like, it's there. You can't get around it.
Another thing in the whole study show, not all studies are created equal. Like this could be
Correct.
a massive quantitative study with a huge sample size and like really rigorous methodology, or it could be a qualitative study with 6 participants that are all the
Yeah.
friends of the professor, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And so and it's not that you can't find anything interesting with a small sample size. So let's address that for a moment. Because what you have is you have a lot of studies out there with relatively small sample sizes. And so and I call them, and I'm not the only one that calls them there's a lot of prominent psychs in the field, way more, like, I'm not prominent at all, but there's prominent psychs in the field. They'll say the same thing I'm telling you, which is we have these academic psychs. So for the uninitiated, this is a person that they may have a license, like an LPC or a licensed psychologist license. They may have a license to do psychotherapy, among other things, but they're largely at teaching institutions and researching institutions. They don't really see a lot of patients. They do just enough to maintain their licenses, and I know some of these people personally. They do just enough to maintain their licenses, and that's about it. But and you'd think, oh, well, they're good researchers. Well, that, that's a debate, right? Yes. So a lot of these people, unfortunately, will try to argue that, oh, well, you can get a really robust data set out of a sample size of 30. Okay, sure. Sure you can. Now, this is where I reference my late father, he loved statistics he loved everything math, but he loved statistics. And if he were here, he would lay it out very eloquently for you about how, let's up that 30 sample size, that hypothetical 30 sample size number, which you see all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you see
Yeah.
things like that, and which, if you've looked too, like, you see it all the time in research. But let's up that number to 100, 50 or 100, doesn't really. Let's do 50, 50. Still relatively small, right? Well, let's say it doesn't matter what you're studying. Let's say you're researching and you find one person out of the 50, right? Let's say you find that there's an interesting outlier. So there's this unusual result, this unusual thing we're looking at. It might be related or adjacent to what you're studying, researching, but it's a little bit of an outlier. Well, if you're doing just real simple statistics, right? A real simple inference would be, okay, well, if we ramp this up and multiply that sample size by 10, so if we're doing a 50 sample size, we ramp it up by 10, 10 times the size, right? So that'd be 500 people. Okay. Well, then you would expect to see that the simple version, stats doesn't work this way really, but like, the simple version would be, you might expect to see that weird result 10 times, right? Well, a lot of times they see outliers, and of course, I think the outliers are where all the interesting. That's what I was taught. The outliers are where all the
Mm.
interesting things are. What's happening in the big
Tails.
fat, yeah, in the tails of the distribution, right? What's happening in the big fat part of the distribution isn't always all that interesting, like, believe it or not. But like, yeah, the tails of the distribution, like, ooh, what's this little thing here? We're like way out, way out at the end. Okay, well, that's fun. What's that? What's going on there? Well, sometimes I say good researchers, but sometimes those folks will, try and replicate study and maybe follow that outlier, right? But like the reality is even with like a 500 sample size, right? Like, all right, how meaningful is that data? How much is that really telling you? And having done clinical research, I sympathize with all the researchers, especially in human behavior and in neuroscience. I absolutely sympathize, because I've done it, with trying to find an adequate sample size. I was taught that if you don't have at least like 3,000, um, people, like a sample of 3,000, you just don't have anything. Doesn't mean you can't like do research with lower numbers. Like all I'm getting at is that it's so much easier to account for variables when you already have like a giant sample size. Now, again, I do get it. Like, some of our sample sizes when I was doing my research years ago, they weren't very big, 100, 200, something like that. But, we did make an effort to try and like do it over and over and over again with different groups of people. But again, I say all this to say that, there's a lot of there's a lot of researchers in our fields that they want to like, yeah, like, again, going back to like the really small sample size. Oh, this is a great, no, it's not really. That tells you literally nothing. Like math would suggest that like you're wrong, right? Like,
According to math, you're wrong.
yeah,
Yeah, I kind of like a somewhat related note. I'm wondering if you could kind of make sense for me or the audience of the replication crisis. I'm assuming you know what
oh,
that is,
I'm
and
yes.
any opinions you have on why that is.
Well, one idea with that is that it is due to small sample sizes. So that is one. If you want to get just pure math, right? Part of the replication issue would be that you just didn't have a big enough sample size, or it wasn't a decent representative sample. Although I lean more towards a sample size versus it being a representative sample. So for those that don't know, representative sample would be, in principle, especially when you're doing like human behavior research, medical research too, but human behavior research, in principle, what you want in your representative sample is supposed to represent the population in which you're studying. So if we're studying all men in the United States, if that's what we're looking at, in principle, I should make every effort for example, I should make every effort to find at least some people from every demographic possible, right? Obviously, that's a problem. Like, problem in the sense of like it's very difficult to do. It takes a lot of time. I would argue more time than money, but time is money, they say. But yeah, like trying to get a good representative sample is hard. It doesn't mean the data can't be valid, but like if we're studying all men in the United States or all women, doesn't matter. Well, you should probably, just to give an example, like you should probably be getting some people to participate, honestly, from literally every major city in the United States. At least a few. You should be getting people to participate from every rural area in the United States. You need, we're quote unquote race, right? Like we should be getting, we need white, African American, Asian, right? Like that, you should be trying to represent all of that, right? Again, it's a challenge. But I argue, though, that more than that, it's just like, so I think part of the replication crisis is sample size, in my opinion. That's a small part of it. There's faulty design. Those can be issues. And faulty design, So I had someone I was posting on TikTok a while back about it was a study on it was violence against like sexual violence against women and somebody got in my DMs and was saying, "Well, this suffers from a how they put it was this is a fellow site. This suffers from a how they put it was a convenience sampling problem." So a convenience sample is just what it sounds like. So when I was doing research with my psychiatrist friend, we actually did convenience sampling. Convenience sampling is not an issue necessarily in and of itself, right? It can be a problem, but like labeling it a problem on its face, that's not like statistically, that's not like an accurate statement. Like convenience samples are not necessarily an issue. It's what it does is it provides limits. Like on its face, it provides limits, right? So like we're in Missouri and I was working in the Kansas City metro areas. All the patients that we were working with were from the Kansas City metro area. So that's just a thing to consider. That doesn't mean though you couldn't replicate that. Go to Kansas City and grab people. It's easy.
Hmm.
I don't know if I still have it. I might have it somewhere in a tote. Like I have the demographic spread on all of that. Like it would not necessarily be difficult to replicate that, right? So I think there's those issues that are sometimes there. Like I say, oh, go ahead.
I was going to throw in a couple possibilities that could be complementary to what you've already thrown out. One is political bias, and
Yes.
one is like a drive for career advancement. So I've got this mentality of publish or perish, and I know what the
Yes.
bias of the journal is. So I'm tailoring my research to fit that bias because I have to publish or I'm not going to move up the food chain.
Yes. So I was going to bring that up later too. So yeah, a lot of people are just not aware that so publish or perish has been a thing that's been around in academia for a very long time. So publish or perish is so for people that are largely at universities. I would say it's true of independent like research groups as well, but it's more true at the university level. Typically to get tenure, so tenure is basically they've got once you get tenure, it makes it difficult to fire you at that point. Not impossible, but like it makes it a little more difficult. And the publisher parish is, yeah, it's a thing where the professors, these academics at researching universities, basically, if they aren't producing research and they aren't getting published in these research journals, for whatever reason, the university, I guess, doesn't value them. I don't know how else to put it. Like they don't look at it as them doing things that they need to do. I'll be honest, there's a part of that ethos that I don't entirely understand in the sense of like, could we just focus on like actually teaching people how to do research and teaching students good ethics and good critical thinking and how to actually do a real science? Like we could do that. Like, why do we have to why do we push people out that basically aren't meeting some sort of like data quota and publishing quota? And yes, you're right. How could that not be a bias? I guess is like, another way to look at it. Like, how does that not taint, uh, how does that not taint things? So I'll give you an example though of when my partner and I were trying to publish. We never got published, by the way, got rejected every time. And can you guess? I'll give you three guesses for
File drawer effect.
Well, a little bit, but I'll tell you what the main reason was that was cited. This was cited every time I got rejected. The main reason that we were told that we were not getting published, it actually didn't even get past the first like round of peer review. The reason it never went anywhere is that we were not affiliated with a university.
Really?
Uh-huh.
Wow.
And
that's quite a bit of gatekeeping right there.
Yeah, and And also we weren't affiliated with, they didn't say this, but it's kind of implied, like we weren't affiliated with, I'll just put it this way, we weren't affiliated with any of the cool kid groups. So like if we had been government employees or something, or we were with like a government funded, group. And again, this is opposite land, right? Like this is the antithesis of what science says and the way math is. Like this is the opposite of what it's supposed to be, right? You mentioned bias earlier. What bias? We're not we're independently, we were doing this independent of everyone. We did this of our own free will, of
Did
our
you have
own
your own
time.
independent funding?
The doc and I did this literally of our own accord in our spare time. That's literally what we did.
And you're punished for that.
Well, that's the way it comes off. Like they did not want to consider anything that we were doing. It was funny because I was looking, I could not find it. I thought I had saved one of these old letters because I wanted to read it to you, but they did mention, if I'm remembering correctly, they mentioned ethical considerations. And it's in the context of we weren't affiliated with a university or we weren't affiliated with a group. And it's like, what do you mean ethical? Like, how are we doing this any less ethically than anybody else? We just, in my opinion, and I'm not trying to like break my own arm, pat myself on the back here, but in my opinion, I thought we were doing good science in the sense of I had an idea. My doc friend also had a similar idea. We're like, hey, let's do a science. This sounds fun. Like, is that not what we're supposed to be doing, right?
Science doesn't feel like the primary objective anymore. It's like, did you jump through the proper hoops?
Yes. And so, there's a bit of populism that's going on in the sense of like, well, what are a bulk of the studies like looking at, right? Some of which have political agendas and all the things. And I mean, it's one thing to, I don't know, like it's one thing to look at like, well, I have a thing here. I was looking this up because I had a faint memory and I was remembering, right, about, and I didn't participate in it, but because I left the APA but I think it's last year's APA convention, right? And so you can go look this up. The name of the report, let me find it. So this was referenced at the APA convention last year. The report was published, I think, November 2023. But the name of the report it's one of their APA consensus statements. Using psychological science to understand and fight health misinformation. Okay. Interesting. So I'd say about a third, a half, hard to quantify. There's quite a few pages in the thing, but a significant amount of it talks about how lying about things and misinformation, how that does affect people, right? And I would not disagree with most of what they said on that. So the actual psychological mechanics, if you will, I wouldn't disagree with most of what they said there. Let me read you the summary. These are their recommendations. So they say, based on these findings, we present 8 specific recommendations for scientists, policymakers, media, and the public to meet the ongoing risk of misinformation to health, well-being, and civic life. Okay, cool. What are the recommendations? Avoid repeating misinformation without including a correction. I've thought on that, but I'll come back to it. Collaborate with social media companies to understand and reduce the spread of harmful misinformation. I'm raising an eyebrow because I'm like,
the Ministry of Truth?
Yeah, Ministry of Truth, right? Should we be doing this? Like, I mean, I'm asking the question, like, does that seem like
our job?
Like our job, right? Yeah. Use misinformation correction strategies with tools already proven to promote healthy behavior. It's going to get better here. There's just a few more. Leverage trusted sources to counter misinformation and provide accurate health information. Okay. Debunk misinformation often and repeatedly using evidence-based methods. This is where, and now the next one is where I really was like, I cannot believe they wrote this. Pre-bunk Pre-bunk misinformation to inoculate susceptible audiences by building skills and resilience from an early age.
I predict you're going to give me some fake news.
Yes, right?
Oh,
Demand data access and transparency from social media companies for scientific research on misinformation. And then the last one is fund basic and translational research in the psychology of health misinformation, including effective ways to counter it. Let me give you an example of how much hot garbage I believe this to be. And I'm referencing COVID because in their report that I gave you the title of, their little white paper, they talk about COVID a lot. Like, I don't know why they're leveling everything like from that base. I don't know why they did that. You know, I can make some guesses, but now I'm not necessarily blaming the APA on this. I will, however, say that there were plenty of known people that I know for a fact were also APA members, such as myself at the time, who were attacking me for this. So, and this is where we have like kind of a convergence of, again, it's not just limited to the APA, but like we have a convergence of like science stuff and how things are getting all wonky and everything's weird, right? So I forget what year it was, but there was like a 40-year meta-analysis on vitamin D. Now, the reason I mentioned vitamin D in this context in regards to like both COVID and the APA is this. Remember, I mentioned differential diagnosis earlier. So if you are vitamin D deficient, and this has been a known thing, as close as I would say we could say this is proven for this sort of thing, I would say this is pretty close. I'm not going to commit that it's absolutely 100%, but it has been a known thing for a lot of years. The data is pretty suggestive of this, is what I will commit to saying, is that common symptoms of vitamin D deficiency are anxiety, depression, anhedonia, so that's the lack of enjoyment of generally enjoyable activities. Let's see, they lack motivation and volition. Okay. And so one thing as I point this out is like, again, when I was going through all my degrees, this stuff was taught. Like my first mentor in psychology, like just he was one of those singularly irritating people, mostly because he was actually like a really kind person, but he was just crazy smart and very knowledgeable. And so like we were taught these things, like, you know, actual health psychology. Like we were taught this stuff. Now, what's that have to do with COVID? Well, there was this 40-year meta-analysis on vitamin D and all of its effects on the body, right? And I forget what year the particular one I referenced, but during COVID, I posted this on social media. I got put in social media jail
for posting an APA study?
Well, this was a vitamin D study, but I'll get to the APA part.
Okay, sorry, yeah.
So I posted a 40-year meta-analysis on vitamin D. And among other things, it talked about the effects of low vitamin D, right? Which is what I already mentioned. But it also had some other interesting things. Again, this is stuff we have known. There's been data supporting this for a very long time, which was that vitamin D will help your immune system, and it can help bolster. And anybody that hears this, you can go look this up. This is not hard information. Just type in vitamin D supports the immune system in regards to respiratory illnesses. You can just type that in, type PubMed into Google, and you'll find it. It's not hard. So, but again, that was some of the other information there, is that it will help. And the data, like their conclusions were that it could help bolster the immune system in general, and that it would help you fight any and all respiratory related illnesses,
including COVID.
Including COVID. Now, COVID wasn't mentioned in the paper because we didn't have COVID.
Yeah, my uncle's a medical doctor, and like shortly after COVID hit the scene, one of the first things he told my family to do was take a vitamin D supplement.
Yeah, and it's probably because he actually might know, you know, these things, right? But when I put this link on, I put it on Twitter, I put it on Facebook, Instagram, it was immediately taken down. And when I asked why, all of them said, you're posting false health
Misinformation.
information. You're posting misinformation. So then I'm not friends with any of these people anymore, but I contacted, and these are people that, have been on social media. I contacted some fellow psychs and I said, "Hey, I post this," and they take it down. They're like, "Why would you post that? That's misinformation." And I'm like, "What? Wait, talk." There's a 40-year meta-analysis that was published, like, I think it was like the one I had posted, I think was published like 6 years or something, or 7 years before COVID ever happened. Well, none of that's accurate. Really? You sure about that? You know? So then I never got the Twitter situation sorted. That never, like, I reached out to them. They just straight up told me, if you don't stop posting this, we're going to ban you. Like, that's what they told me. Meta, what is now Meta, I did get to have a chat with one of their representatives, because their AI or their algorithm was immediate. Like, the minute I posted it, it would disappear.
Wow.
And I talked to one of them, and so it wasn't a long conversation, but how it went was, well, you're posting false medical information. I said, this is a peer-reviewed study. It's a 40-year meta-analysis. And then they're like, then they clapped back with, well, we can't have non-health care people posting things. Of course, I'm thinking, what does that have to do with anything? And then I said, I'm a licensed mental health professional in my state. What are you talking about? I'm not a healthcare person. Like, that's how it all went down. They finally, I don't know if you remember, they still do this. I don't know if you're not as much, but do you remember, like, sometimes during that time they would, if someone posted something, it would gray it out and they would have the
Yes.
warning. Do you remember
Yeah.
this?
Yeah.
They had the
Like
warning
you're viewing like a violent image or something.
yes. Yeah, this post may contain false medical information. You
Yeah.
remember that. And like I say, some people say, well, what's that have to do with the APA? Well, I think part of the issue is, yeah, because I think largely as a scientific, supposedly, that I think that's the thing is, like, when I joined, they were, in my opinion, they were supposed to be the bastions of scientific rigor and inquiry, and we were not supposed to be beholden to any other interests. And then you can go to, like, I won't even go to an APA sponsored event anymore, because I go look at who funded it.
Who's that?
Right? Well, like pharmaceutical companies might be funding this
Of
thing.
course.
And
I want to
yeah.
like kind of bounce off of that in a little bit different direction.
Sure,
You
sure.
are former APA member. You're talking about APA stuff, and you are a probably, I guess, less than a quarter of therapists are male, and you're a male therapist. So I think it's 2019, the APA's recommendation on working with men and boys. What can you tell me about
Yes.
that?
Well, I read it, and then I was like, what the heck did I just read? So I read it again.
That's your toxic masculinity.
Yeah. So, and then I read it again. And so how I viewed it was, what our stance is, we are pathologizing a lot of what may be inherently male traits. And again, there's vigorous debate to be had on cliche male versus female traits, right? Like, I think there's a healthy debate to be had, and we should have it. But the way it's framed, and this is not behind a paywall. Anyone can go read it. It's available for free to download. They largely seemed to be pathologizing traits that are not necessary. And that's the thing. What I was taught, and you go look at any old text, old good text too. What I was taught, and what I believe we're supposed to be taught, and this also comes from a point of science. And what I was taught is, you're supposed to have this particular thing. And I'm going to go back to the boys and men thing. But we're taught that a behavior is a behavior. That's what we're supposed to be taught, right? So if a patient comes to me and they're talking about, let's say they have kleptomania, they have a really big problem going into Target and stealing stuff, right? Well, a lot of people, to the uninitiated, the untrained, a lot of people want to assign value and meaning to that behavior. Well, that's bad. They're doing something illegal. Now, they are doing something illegal, but that sort of misses the point in how we're supposed to treat people, right? So, what I was taught, what I believe still that we're supposed to be taught is like, I'm supposed to be basically, I'm supposed to sit here with my notepad and I make a note. All right, patient. Patient is stealing things on the daily from Target, right? I'm not supposed to like, I'm really not supposed to do anything with that other than, okay, talk to me about this. What's happening with you? Like, what do you have thoughts on? Like, is there thoughts going? You know what I mean? Like, when you're talking to a patient on something, it doesn't matter what it is. Hey, so you tell me you're stealing. Okay. So what's up with that? Let's explore that. Like, I'm not supposed to assign any value and meaning to that, right? I say that because if you go read that, boys and men, how we're supposed to, the treatment guidelines or whatever, how we're supposed to do this, yeah, that's not how it's framed. Not even remotely. The APA defends it. They have not backed down on that
Hmm.
either. Like, the
Yeah.
APA is standing on their laurels and saying, no, we stand by this. Y'all are just misinterpreting.
I think one of the most disturbing parts about that study is, you could have a man come into therapy with severe chronic depression, already dealing with lots of shame and guilt and things like that. And one of the things you're supposed to do is have a conversation with him about his privilege. That just
Yes.
seems perverse to me.
Yeah, and adjacent to that is also like the APA. I forget the name of the little white paper on it. It's a similar thing. Have you seen? I can't remember the name of it, but have you seen the one where how they talk about what you're supposed to do with anybody that reports anything like gender identity issues or dysphoria? Or have you seen that one?
No.
It's similar in the sense of basically their guidelines are you're supposed to immediately affirm whatever it is they're saying. And some people think, well, don't you want affirming stuff? And it's like, well, again, what I was taught is I'm not here to affirm anything. To quote Jordan Peterson, people can love or hate the guy, but to quote Jordan Peterson, that's not what we're supposed to do. Like, you want to be better. How he put it is, I'm on the side of, if you want to aim up, I think is how he puts it, I'm on the side of you aiming up.
So,
Reg-
one of the things you said you specialize in is addiction. So we can kind of get into this a little bit, but this is kind of something I bang my head against the wall in my program over and over. This idea of affirming care. So there's gender affirming care, but just in general, it feels like you're supposed to just be a nice person who agrees with the client, right? But if you're
yeah.
working, you can debate how well that works in certain areas, but it seems to run into a wall pretty quickly when you get into addiction. Like, if someone says, I'm going to go do heroin because heroin is good for me and that's my truth, like, it would be psychotic to affirm that, you know?
Yeah, and I think some of the proponents of the gender related stuff would try to argue that those aren't, comparable, right? However, the principle you're driving at, it's the same, right? All the data we have on that which we call psychotherapy suggests that, well, I'll quote another psychologist, Jonathan Shedler. I believe I saw him write that, and I don't know if actually it was his quote, it might have been someone else's, but it's a truth, which is you don't really quote unquote start psychotherapy until you let the patient talk for a bit and try to apprehend what is going on. So, and I'll go back to the addiction thing too, but with the gender thing, what people do with all of that is really none of my concern, right? That's different from saying if someone comes to me and says, hey, I think I'm a woman in a man's body, right? Well, as a therapist, the first thing I should be doing is literally, it sounds cliche, but it's a very real thing, is okay, tell me more.
Yeah.
I need to understand what's going on here. I can't, because it's very much like on the medical side of things, right? Now, ours is not such a finite and discrete venture as it is on the medical side of things. Yeah, because they have blood tests and x-rays and, stuff that's very a little bit more concrete. We're still kind of in no man's land a little bit,
Yeah.
we therapists, right? But it's stupid to act deliberately on anything that resembles treatment when you haven't apprehended the problem. Same thing goes with addictions too, right? And like I say, this is not like discounting anybody's experience in the sense of, well, this is how I feel. Well, that's fine. I need to understand though. Like, I can't do anything productive as a therapist if I do not understand. And it is irresponsible of me to just say, okay, cool. That's, as you put, that's psychotic. Like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Same thing with addiction. Well, yeah, you use heroin and like it's good for me. And no, like, now the one thing I will say about addictions is, now I do hear stories of other therapists that do kind of what you said. Like, they kind of just like agree with the patient. Like, I have heard that even in the addiction world, which is a
Mm,
little weird to me.
yeah.
But like, there are some things that are objectively not good for us. And I don't remember how they word it, but like my state, the state of Missouri in general does support, like, for the most part, things that are pretty objective. Like if someone comes in with like an alcohol issue or a heroin issue, as far as the state of Missouri is concerned, that the jury's out on that one, right? Which is, yeah, like if the patient reports that they're shooting up heroin every day or they're drinking 17 beers in 3 hours every night, feel free to tell them to like, hey, I've got some concerns for you. We need to like get this to stop quick, fast, and in a hurry. But at the same time, the principle is still the same. Tell me more. Help me understand this. What's happening here? How long's this been going on? And I will just tell you, like, in both cases, like, whether it's again gender stuff, addictions, rarely is the issue going on with the patient. Rarely is it what you thought it was when you first met them.
Mm,
So that 8 second ish like window where we, first impressions, right? I was taught you have no impression of this patient and you're not going to have it for a while.
mm.
And my old mentor said, oh, you're going to have to get 5 sessions in before you have really any decent concept of anything that's going on with this person. And it was very much the thing of, again, tell me more. What's happening here? Like, I'm not going to make any sort of pronouncement at all if I ever make one, but I'm not going to make one like just straight away, in regards to any of
If
those
we
things.
could
And
go
yeah,
back for a moment to,
yeah, sure, sure.
you talked a bit about your music program where you had a difference in philosophy. And I'm wondering if you could describe that, first of all, and if there was something similar in your grad program for counseling.
When I was an undergrad, so I was part of the music therapy department. So I was gonna do the research that I mentioned that I did. I wanted to include university students. So the way the process was, before it ever got to the review board, so sometimes they call it an ethics board or the institutional review board, before it ever got to the board, you had to run it through the department head. And so I gave my proposal to the department head, and all that man did was just insult me up one side and down the other. That's basically all he did. Like, he rejected it, didn't leave a lot of notes on why he rejected it. And when I talked to him about it, he's saying things like, where are you even getting these ideas? I'm like, what does it matter where I get the idea? Like, it's an idea. Like, who gives a rip? It's science. Like, let's just do a science, right? These are baseless, without merit. Those, like, academically speaking, those are some fairly harsh words.
What was the study you were trying to conduct?
It was what I said that my doc friend and I eventually
Oh,
ended up
gotcha.
doing. And so, like, the department head wouldn't even let it go to the review board. And then he's like, these are not the, like, this isn't what we do here. And what do you mean this isn't what we do here? What does that even mean? So it went from kind of veiled insults to vague accusations. And I had even run it by my mentor, who was at the same university, it's just different department. So, and unfortunately, he ultimately, like he said, well, that guy's an idiot. I know him. He's a moron. And I said, well, what about running it through the psychology department? He said, that's his response. They're not going to let it fly either. So that's part of why, a big part of why I left the music therapy department, because like they just weren't, I don't know, they just didn't seem down for things. In grad school, on the other hand, I had a pretty good experience in my graduate program. The most irritating but very useful and very educational and very helpful class was, they called it basic helping skills, which is like, it's basically your bare bones, things like, okay, well, the best way to sum it is, it's the cliche, how does that make you feel? But
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
but it's the active listening that is supposed to be there. That's the, okay, tell me more. Oh, what about this? What about that? Like, it's not even like, it was the things where we would sit in class and be like, is this what therapy is? Actually, kind of, yeah, that is
Mm.
what therapy is supposed to
Yeah.
be. And it was a very difficult class because most of us were like, oh, this is not what I thought it was. It wasn't bad, but it was like, and so, no, my grad school experience was pretty good. But there have been graduates out of that same program in years since. They were changing the curriculum. So my cohort was the last cohort of the old curriculum. And I've met with students that are newer grads from the newer curriculum, and I shake my head. I'm like, no.
What are you saying?
Well, that's a lot of what we already talked about. Like, you've got students that, like, they'll come to you with an issue, and then I'm just sitting there thinking, like, you should not be coming to me for, it doesn't matter what it is. Like, you should not be coming to me for this issue. Like, and I'll give you just a general example. They'll come to me with a thing. Hey, what do you do here? And that's what you do in supervision. You talk about cases. And I'll say, well, have you ever asked them this? And in my mind, again, I'm a seasoned professional, but in my mind, it's the most elementary basic thing that they should have already taught you in grad school. Right. And they'll say, oh, I never thought of that. Or I've never heard of this. I'm like, did you read your textbooks, or did they teach you, like, what's happening here? Right.
One of my classmates had a quote. She's a very progressive woman, and she said, this program is nothing but fluff and wokeness, right? So there's this element of political bias that it's pretty heavy-handed, but there's this other element that we're not actually learning useful therapy skills. And I feel like if we had a 2-hour class where we're getting deep into learning skills and theory, and at the end you do a land acknowledgement, it probably wouldn't be that big of a deal. But the fact that we're just training counselors and therapists so poorly is really disturbing to me.
Yeah, and like I say, that's why I see. That's why I say that I see a lot of this out of students that I meet with, and heck, even like newly minted therapists that, like, I won't even go to an in-person seminar anymore. It doesn't matter who's putting it on. I won't go. I won't even go to the ones that might be a little less quote unquote woke, because I don't like how those people are either. Like, it's like, I feel like I'm sitting in no man's land somewhere, and we're like we've got the extremes going on.
What do you see? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. You're fine.
What do you see broadly in the field of therapy, like as the social justice influence? How have you observed that?
Well, I was looking some stuff up because, like I said, I was making notes before we had this conversation today. And, one thing that I would say is, and I think the issue with the APA in general, again, they're supposed to, in theory, like, they're supposed to be the preeminent bastions of whatever. And, like, but then, well, and some people might argue, well, why are you quibbling about this? And so the example I'll give is, so, like, if you go get a photo of from last year's APA convention, there is a photo of the audience and for the keynote addresses. How many men are there? Right. Back in, like, I think it was like 1980-ish or whatever, the distribution of men versus women in therapy, like being psychologists, therapists, whatever, it tipped over to being slightly more women than men. It is now pushing, and it has been for a while, it's pushing like 80%.
Yeah.
It depends on which area you look in, like, but 70 to 80% ish. is the range. And some people think, well, why is that bad? And I'm not saying that that in and of itself is bad, right? It's like the question of why aren't there many men in nursing, right? I don't think it's necessarily bad that there's more women than men in nursing. And I don't think it's necessarily bad that there are more women than men in psychology and in the helping fields, right? In general, I don't think that's necessarily bad. However, when your professional organization, I'm not the only one that brought it up either. When you bring up things like they're talking about a lot of equity now in the APA. And again, I don't have an issue with, like, if we're going to talk about equal opportunity, I don't have an issue with that. If you're going to talk about equality of outcome, I do have an issue with that. But the problem there is, like, they don't seem all that, like, they're cherry picking which equality of outcome and which equity standards they want to uphold. Like, I even tried to address it with some APA folks about, it's basically radio silent on the feminism of the feminizing of the APA. And of course, they say in no uncertain terms, well, what you're saying doesn't really support our vision, our mission statement. It's like, I have nothing against women. That's not the issue. What it is, like, if you point out, hey, you say you want an equal distribution, an equal representation of all demographics, right? Well, what say you about the fact that, like, 80% of your members are pushing that are women versus men? And then when you want to talk about, like, how we're helping this group and that group, well, men are kind of over here, like, unless it's some little niche, like, area, right? Like, it's fine if it's, and I don't have an issue with this. I really don't. Like, it's fine if we're talking about supporting black males, right? Like, or African American males, however many words that nowadays. Like, I don't have an issue with that because, again, I spent most of my life in the Kansas City area. Like, those communities, there are things going on that need addressing. I have no problem with that. But again, when you start, like, you're doing like that, they've begun doing things at the expense of, well, I think some groups, they're doing it at the expense of, they're also doing this, they're doing things in general at the expense of science. There's a really great thread. I want to say the guy's name's Colin Wright. Don't hold me
Yeah,
to that.
yeah.
But did you see it? He has a really great thread on the APA statement about gender and all of that. And he goes through line item, like,
He's
kind of
good at tearing that
debunking.
apart.
Yeah. And like I say, in the big picture of everything, I don't care what anybody does with themselves. I really don't. It's of no consequence to me. The issue I do have, though, is if you're going to say something that is demonstrably false, you're supporting something that I can show is demonstrably false, but you're going to tell me it's true. Like, okay, why? Why are we doing that? Right? Like, what's driving that agenda? Like, why are we doing this? I don't know how much time we have left, but, like, I will, like, it's not, like, necessarily like those agendas, but are you familiar with the Hoffman report?
Sounds familiar. What is that?
So in 2015, the Hoffman report, among other things, there's an independent investigation into APA leadership. And what they found, here's the irony. So, let me tell you the thing that happened. I'll tell you, like, who it was that was the main offender of this. Someone in the APA organization, I'll tell you who, so I wrote all this down. They bent ethical guidelines in the mid 2000s to accommodate the Department of Defense during the War on Terror. The APA's PENS Task Force, Psychological Ethics and National Security, greenlit psychologist roles in Guantanamo Bay interrogations, and this included abusive interrogation tactics, waterboarding, all sorts of other things. And the irony here is that it was, I don't know how to say his last name, but Stephen Benke, Behnke. He was the ethics director of the APA, and he was the one Like, and now there was no money that appeared to be exchanging hands, although the report sort of suggests that he was attempting to curry favor with the government. But who knows why, though?
Hmm.
But like that's kind of like it's kind of a weird deal. Like, all right, that's our professional organization, right? And it didn't just involve him. There were other APA people involved. There were other psychology people involved. So like it's one of those, like I say, it's one of those things where I loop back to the beginning. Like I don't know what's caused everything, but to me that's a pretty big problem. When one of your leaders, specifically the one that heads who's the ethics director, is doing this.
Yeah. I've got two questions left for you. One
Sure.
is, how, in the looking at the field of therapy, how do we fix things?
So I think one of the best things that we can do really is, one, figure out what real therapy is and try to do that, like learn that and be a good therapist, number one. I get so many patients, new patients, that like quite a few of new patients will have, I don't know what the distribution is. I don't keep numbers on this necessarily, but like there's quite a few that have seen a therapist before, right? And again, I'm not trying to laud myself here. However, I hear alarmingly often from these new patients. We'll get like 4 or 5 sessions in and they'll make comments like, I spent 4 years with my last therapist. I've never heard things like this. I never heard any of this out of my therapist. Okay. Now you can take that a whole bunch of different ways, right? Now these are patients that will, if you could, corner them and ask them, hey, do you think your therapist David's pretty good? I like to think they'll tell you yes, because like I think we're doing pretty good work and we're getting good outcomes. But I say all this because, again, I hear it alarmingly often, like comments like that, or I don't think I knew what real therapy was till I met you. Okay. Sometimes they don't elaborate, right? Now, sometimes patients do elaborate and you hear all sorts of crazy stories. And I like crazy stories to the level where I tell this patient, I say, if you're about to tell me who that therapist is, I don't want to know. I don't want to know who that is. I probably should want to know, so I don't refer to him, but I don't want to know. And so, like I say, I think a big thing is, like I say, I think be a good therapist, figure out what that is. It's not all this pop psychology, pseudoscience nonsense. There is a time and place for stuff that might be in that bucket. Like, yeah, I think there's a time and a place to suggest, like a breathing exercise, because there is data to support some of that, sure. Ultimately, with therapy, it is getting to have a deeper understanding of self. That's the ultimate goal. It's like learning how a car works. Like, if you don't know how you work, have fun fixing yourself. Like, have fun. And you don't, a ladybug on my microphone. Like, it doesn't mean you have to see a therapist for that, but it's just to say, like, that is how that works. Like, it's a steep learning curve to learn yourself, right? But also, I think the other thing I would say to like try and fix the problem is, unfortunately, it's some of it, like I've had to take a break myself, but like it's getting involved in things that we may not want to get involved in, which is things like go make some noise on social media. I've been blocked by I don't know how many other therapists in the field, even though I'm not saying anything weird. I can't believe you think this. I'm like, what? Like, I believe in science. I just told you that, like, I can prove mathematically that your analysis is just mathematically incorrect. Like, I mean, it goes to every extreme.
I've been accused of hate speech and being a Nazi for saying that we probably shouldn't castrate mentally ill kids. It's surprising what gets you branded as a fanatic.
Yeah, and like I say, if someone wants to do that to themselves, whatever. I don't care. I do draw a line though at saying, okay, I'm not going to immediately jump to this thing when I just met you. One, like, I'm not endorsing it. Like, to me, that's a very permanent solution to a problem that, regardless of what I believe about anything, like, I don't feel comfortable, like, being a person that would endorse that in the first place, because, like, that's just whoa. And we can come at it from a bunch of different scientific angles and all of that, but, I think erring on the side of caution and erring on the side of, "All right, well, tell me more about that first before you go anywhere with it." But I've had the same accusations thrown at me, and I've been always been very consistent, like, can we just, like, get into it a little more, but instead of just jumping to this thing? And then, like, people, like, wanna fuss about that, right?
Mm.
But that's why I say, like, I think it's a hard thing, like, getting involved, like, making noise on social media, I think is helpful. I don't know how helpful, but I think it does something. I think if you've got I think it's for it, like, I've considered trying to go back to the APA to get into the organization to see if, to make positive change and affect change. That's a lot. Like,
Uphill battle.
I felt like I was worn out with what little I did because, yeah, it is an uphill battle.
So I got one final question. This is kind of looking at society broadly, but what is one thing that we're not talking about or not talking about enough that we should be talking about?
Well, how I'm going to take that is how I think. Can I come at it from the angle
Yeah.
of how we're educating people at
Hmm.
large?
Yeah.
Oh, when you ask that question, what I immediately think of is, all right, in this supposed age of enlightenment and information, what are we teaching people, right? And so what I think about is, like, we should be teaching people how to have good critical thinking skills from an early, like, when I say kindergarten, I mean it. Like, we should be teaching people how to have good critical thinking skills. We should be teaching people how to actually learn. We should be teaching people the actual scientific method. We should be teaching people how to, and this is at all ages, we should be teaching people how to, like, how to communicate well with other people. At this stage of everything, we do have decent behavioral information. Like, we should be teaching people more psychology. The problem with this is, like, if you, like, I could go say this to a bunch of educators and psychs, and they may go down some completely different roads than I would go down. Like, I don't have an agenda. My agenda is truth and reality. That's my agenda. And I think that's a lot of what we should be pushing. I mean, it's hard to encapsulate it all. Like, there's so much there.
I like this
But
idea of teaching people how to think rather than what to think. Like, you give them tools of critical thinking skills and let them come to their own conclusions.
yeah, like, we homeschool our 3 children, and, like, our homeschooling ethos largely revolves around, do you know how to think? Do you know what the actual scientific method is? Do you know how to get information, where to get it, how to learn, how to disseminate, how to parse information, how to run, like, when they get old enough, like, hey, how do you look at a data table, and how do you look at, like, all these things? Like, a healthy dose of skepticism we teach. Now, funnily enough, my oldest is 18. Funnily enough, that kid's got some different views than we have, just nothing like necessarily super weird or anything, but she has some particular views on things, some of which we didn't teach her.
Hmm.
But I don't have an issue with that because, again, one thing she's very bullish about is what we did teach her, which is, do you know how to think? Do you know how to, like, you're allowed to form your own opinion, and then I think also, like, how to deal with people that have differing opinions.
I was homeschooled from kindergarten through 9th grade, and I would say I'm very
Mm.
grateful for A, the critical thinking skills, and B, the love of learning. I feel like I see
Yeah.
so many people who come through school and are just like learning is not fun. It's boring. It's, kind of burnout on it. And to me, like, learning's
Uh-huh.
always been exciting, and I'm grateful that that was implanted in me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely another thing that we, like, push here is, like, this is fun.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what my wife and I live too, is, like, you can call it being a geek or whatever, but, like, to me, everything's interesting.
Yeah.
Nearly everything is interesting. Like,
Good way to go through life, I think.
yeah, I mean, I think, it's going to sound really geeky, but I think when you get kind of hooked into a deep dive of how the cement cooling stacks at power plants are made. Like, what you think? Was there anything special there? Like, it's fascinating to me. Like, but everything's
Yeah.
fascinating to me. Like I could get distracted with like, and I don't have much here in my office, but like I could get really distracted with just think like my brain's just pew pew pew, like.
Yeah.
But that's what we that's also a lot of what we teach our kids too is like you say, a love for learning. So
Yeah. Well, that was a lot of great answers. We had a great conversation. I loved talking to you. David, thank you so much for coming on. Hope we can talk again
yeah,
sometime. If
yeah,
you'll hang
anytime, let me know.
Yeah, if you'll hang on until the upload is finished, I hope to talk to you again.
All right, sounds good.